Looking back now, it's almost comical how everything began. I once considered Clara to be the love of my life, my other half, my soulmate. I realize how cliched that sounds, but back then it felt utterly genuine. We crossed paths during our second year at university. It was the classic boy meets girl scenario. While she immersed herself in literature, dazzling everyone with her flair for drama, I was bogged down with the rigors of engineering classes. From the moment we connected, it felt like we were glued together. Clara wasn't just stunning. She had this magnetic quality that drew everyone in. Her dark hair always carried a hint of vanilla, and her laugh had the power to fill any room. It felt as if the universe revolved around her, and I adored that about her, or at least I thought I did. I was young and naive, swept up in this fantasy of love. We experienced all the typical moments: late-night discussions about our dreams, pointless arguments that felt catastrophic, and that unforgettable first time we were intimate. It was awkward and clumsy, yet it felt like pure magic. In hindsight, that was probably when I first convinced myself that Clara was destined to be the one. When you're young, every moment feels like it's part of a grand romantic narrative. Our wedding unfolded just as she envisioned, a seaside affair in Cornwall, complete with a picturesque backdrop that seemed pulled straight from a movie. As we exchanged our vows, the waves crashed behind us, almost foreshadowing how our marriage would ultimately unravel. Back then, it all felt like a fairy tale. And the honeymoon? I naively believed it would mark the beginning of our forever. I had no idea that forever could come with an expiration date. Fast forward a few years, and life morphed into that same monotonous routine you often hear about. Work, home-cooked dinners, the occasional night out. I secured a job as a project manager while she found her niche at a local gallery. We settled into what I thought was a comfortable, predictable existence. In retrospect, it might have simply been dull. That's the thing no one warns you about. When you're cruising on the idea of what marriage ought to be, it's easy to overlook the reality of what it truly is. Then came that fateful night at the club, the moment everything spiraled out of control. I rarely went out anymore, especially after we got married, but my friends Jake and Ryan practically forced me to join them. Jake has always been the wild one, the guy who somehow knows all the bouncers by name, while Ryan, he's the quiet type, always up for anything, but never the one to take the lead. I can still picture stepping into that chaotic venue, some godforsaken club in town, alive with pounding music, flashing neon lights, and the overwhelming stench of booze and sweat. It felt like I was thrust back into my university days, as if I were 21 again, free from any worries beyond the present moment. We kicked off the night slowly, shots first, then beers followed by more shots. Before I knew it, I was completely plastered, just as Jake had hoped I would be. In that haze, I remember feeling invigorated, as if I had been sleepwalking through life and was finally waking up. We were laughing over some drunken joke, probably mocking the DJ, who looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. For a while, it was just the three of us, a welcome escape from the monotony, from the pressures of work, marriage, and the grind of adulthood. Then I spotted her, Sophie. Initially, I didn't think much of it. She was just another pretty girl dancing, lost in her own crowd of friends. But occasionally, her eyes would catch mine, and there was something electric in that connection, a pull I couldn't shake off. I tried to ignore it, to push it away. I was married, right? But the more I attempted to dismiss it, the more I found myself drawn in. It was as if she were looking straight through me, uncovering something I didn't even realize I was hiding. Jake, in true form, nudged me playfully. "Mate, she's totally into you," he slurred, spilling half his drink. "Go say hi." At first, I brushed it off with a laugh, shaking my head. But then a voice in my head, louder than it should have been, whispered, "Why the hell not?" Honestly, I felt like a different person that night, as if nothing else mattered except for that very moment. So I made my way over. We struck up a conversation. Sophie was the complete opposite of Clara. Blonde, boisterous, and a bit too forward. Exactly the type of girl who knows her appeal and wields it like a weapon. And the wildest part? She was fully aware that I was married. I can't even recall how it came up, but I remember her playfully tracing the ring on my finger, a sly grin on her face, as she asked, "So, what's a married guy like you doing out here without his wife?" I should have walked away right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I laughed and we continued chatting, flirting, drinking. She'd occasionally touch my arm, leaning in close enough for me to catch the scent of tequila on her breath. For the first time in years, I felt desired. Not in the way Clara wanted me to remember to take out the trash or to behave at dinner parties, but in a way that felt exhilarating and new. One thing led to another, and suddenly we found ourselves pressed against the bathroom door, the music still thumping but muffled as if the world outside had faded away. I remember the warmth of her hands on me, the taste of her lips, and that intoxicating rush of adrenaline that made everything feel surreal, as if I were watching some other fool throw away his life from the outside. It's nothing like the movies, you know. There's no gradual, romantic build-up. It was chaotic and frantic, like we were both trying to prove something to the world or maybe just to ourselves. And throughout it all, that insistent voice in my head kept reminding me that none of this truly mattered, that it was just a game, a fleeting moment of madness. And just like that, it was over. We exited that bathroom and drifted apart, and I stumbled back to Jake and Ryan as if nothing had transpired. But everything had changed. I felt it the moment I stepped out of that club, the cool night air hitting me like a slap to the face. My head was spinning, not just from the alcohol, but also from the guilt that gnawed at me. I remember Ryan giving me a sideways glance, a half smirk on his lips, and asking, "You all right, mate?" And I lied. I replied, "Yeah, I'm fine." But I wasn't. Deep down, I knew I was far from okay, and I couldn't take any of it back. That night should have been nothing more than a foolish mistake, something I could bury deep down and forget about. But mistakes have a way of catching up to you, and I had no clue how that single night would unravel the life I thought I had. If only I'd known, maybe I would have made a different choice. But who am I kidding? Once you step onto that path, there's no turning back. The days that followed my betrayal were pure hell. You know that feeling when you've done something so monumentally stupid that you spend every waking moment convincing yourself it didn't really happen? Yeah, that was me. I thought I could return to my life as if everything was normal. Pretend that night in the club was just some drunken slip, a glitch in the matrix that no one else would discover. But secrets are toxic. They seep into every aspect of your life, and before long, they've tainted everything around you. Clara didn't know, at least not initially. Or maybe she did. It's hard to gauge with women. They always seem to have this uncanny sixth sense for these things. Regardless, I tried my best to hide it. I went to work, came home, and did my best to act like the loving husband I was supposed to be. And let me tell you, that was no easy feat. Every word felt forced, like I was an actor fumbling through lines in a terrible play. At dinner, she'd share stories about her day at the gallery, some drama with a coworker or a new exhibit coming up, and I'd sit there, nodding along, while my mind wandered elsewhere. I was terrified that if I dared to look her in the eyes, she'd see it all, the guilt, the betrayal, the raw truth of what I had done. The silences were the hardest part. Clara wasn't typically the quiet type. She was more the sort who could chatter on endlessly, even when you wish she wouldn't. But those silences at dinner, during our TV time, or just lying in bed, they were deafening. I'd find myself staring at my plate, feeling as though my guilt was glaringly obvious, written in bold letters across my face. I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't keep my story straight. One moment, I'd be overcompensating, putting on a cheerful act and cracking stupid jokes. The next, I'd be snapping at her for no reason, my nerves fraying like a worn-out rope. And then there was the intimacy, or the lack thereof. Our sex life had never been stellar, but now, good grief, it felt like walking a tightrope. The last thing I wanted was to touch her, but avoiding it only made matters worse. Each night brought a new excuse, Long day at work, not feeling well, maybe tomorrow. I could see it pained her, the way she'd sigh and roll over, pulling the covers tightly around herself. But I just couldn't do it. Not with that weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating me with every brush against her. When night finally fell and she was asleep, that's when the panic would hit. My mind would spiral, running through every possible scenario of what would happen if I came clean. Sometimes, I'd envision her crying, utterly heartbroken, screaming at me in disbelief. Other times, I'd picture her expression turning cold, icy, as she simply walked out and slammed the door behind her. There were moments when I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd forgive me, that we could work it out like they do in those rom-coms she loved to watch. But deep down, I understood better. I knew Clara, and I was all too aware that this would shatter her. But I couldn't keep it bottled up forever. The secret felt like a living creature, clawing at my insides, demanding to be released. I thought maybe confiding in someone would lighten the load. So one night, while Jake was off doing God knows what, I grabbed a couple of beers and met up with Ryan. He's always been the type to listen, the guy who will hear you out without casting judgment. We settled on a grimy old bench in the park, passing beers back and forth while watching the cars zip by. I yearned to tell him everything, to spill my guts and let him share some of this burden. But every time I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come. How do you articulate something so devastating? How do you tell your best mate that you've just ruined your entire life in one reckless night? So I kept silent. I made some feeble excuse about work stress, and Ryan nodded, sensing there was more to it, but choosing not to pry. That was it. I returned home, sat in my car for a good half hour before finally stepping through the front door, feeling more isolated than ever. Days bled into weeks, and every minute felt like a ticking time bomb. I could hardly sleep. Each time Clara looked at me, it felt as if she knew, as if she could see right through me. I'd catch her staring occasionally, a strange look in her eyes, as if she were trying to solve an unsolvable puzzle. I couldn't handle it. I knew I had to tell her, but I kept delaying it, inventing new excuses, clinging to the hope that maybe I could somehow make it disappear. Then one night it all came crashing down. We were seated at the table, eating a bland chicken dish she had prepared, when out of the blue, she asked, "What's wrong with you lately?" I tried to play dumb, pretending I had no idea what she was talking about. "Nothing, why?" I mumbled, shoving another forkful of food into my mouth. "Don't give me that," she snapped, dropping her fork on her plate with a loud clatter. "You've been acting strange for weeks. What the hell is going on, Jack?" And there was my moment of reckoning. I could choose to lie, to fabricate some story about work stress, or any of the other half-baked excuses I had been leaning on. Or I could come clean, and for some reason, whether it was the fire in her eyes, filled with anger and confusion, or simply the unbearable weight of it all, I told her. I laid it all bare. Clara, I slept with someone else, I admitted. Those words felt like knives slicing through my throat as they escaped, and once they were out, there was no taking them back. The silence that followed was suffocating. At first, she just stared at me, seemingly trying to comprehend whether I was joking. Then the reality of it all struck her. Her face twisted into an expression I'd never seen before, a mix of rage, pain, and disgust. And then she completely lost it. She hurled her plate at me, a full-on throw as if she were pitching in the World Series. The damn thing shattered against the wall, food splattering everywhere. "You piece of shit," she screamed. "You fucking coward. How could you?" Her voice cracked, and I noticed the tears forming in her eyes, but she quickly brushed them away, as if refusing to allow me the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Was she worth it, huh? Some random slut? Was it worth destroying our marriage over one night? It wasn't like that, I swear. I tried to interject, but she cut me off. "Oh, don't you dare. Don't even try to make this sound like it wasn't your fault," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "God, you're pathetic. You've always been pathetic. I can't believe I wasted my life on you." I reached out, desperate to say something, anything, that might soothe the storm I'd unleashed, but she slapped my hand away. "Don't touch me," she warned, her tone icy. "Don't you fucking touch me. I can't stand the sight of you right now." She stormed out of the room, leaving me there, staring at the chaos around me. The shattered plate, the food smeared across the wall, and the gaping hole that had once been my marriage. All I could think was, this is it. This is where everything ends. You think you understand pain until you see the person you love gaze at you, as if you're the worst thing that's ever happened to them. And then, believe me, you realize you didn't know a damn thing about pain. The irony of betrayal is that it forces you to reflect on every single moment and question just how blind you truly were. I once considered Mark my best mate, someone I trusted like family. It turns out you never really know people as well as you think, and you definitely don't grasp how low they can sink until you find yourself staring up from the depths. Mark and I go way back. He and his wife, Ella, moved in next door shortly after Clara and I bought our house. They were about 10 years older than us, but down to earth, always up for a chat over the fence or a beer in the garden. When Ella left him about a year after they settled in, ran off with some guy from her work or something, I did what any decent neighbor would do. I was there for him, invited him over, let him vent about the mess, even though most of it was just drunken rants and incoherent shouting. We bonded over it, forming a twisted brotherhood of guys who had been dealt a rough hand by life. From that point on, Mark became a fixture in our lives. He'd come over on Saturdays to help me tackle various home projects, installing shelves, patching up the leaky roof, you name it. He was handy, likely because he was always tinkering with something to distract himself from his own problems. Clara would joke that he was more useful than I ever was, but I never took offense to that. Back then, I thought nothing of it. We were just mates, helping each other out. And to be honest, Mark felt like a big brother to me, someone I thought had my back. Or at least, that's what I believed. It wasn't just about the housework, either. We'd fire up the grill during the summer, enjoying barbecues together. We'd crack open some beers, set up the grill, and he'd bring over those ridiculously spicy sausages he always favored, the kind that could burn your mouth if you weren't careful. Clara adored those barbecues. She'd sit on the porch with a glass of wine, watching us act like kids. Mark and I tossing a football, poking fun at each other, discussing whatever was on TV that week. At the time, it all felt completely normal. Too normal. But there were signs. There always are, I suppose. Little moments that felt off, yet I brushed them aside. Like that one time when I came home from work earlier than usual and found Mark sitting at our kitchen table with Clara, a couple of cups of coffee in front of them. I remember walking in, feeling as if I'd stumbled into a conversation that wasn't meant for me. Clara laughed it off, claiming Mark had just stopped by to borrow some sugar, and then they began chatting about mundane small talk to fill the awkward silence. But the way they were positioned, too close for comfort. And I recall Mark looking at me with this strange expression. Was it guilt or maybe surprise? I shrugged it off because why wouldn't I? They were friends, just like we all were. That's what I told myself. You don't notice the cracks when you're not actively searching for them. Then there were the times Mark would drop by when I wasn't home. Clara always insisted he was just being neighborly, checking in or delivering something for me. Because I trusted him and trusted her, I never questioned it. Why would I? If my marriage was a sinking ship, I was the oblivious captain steering it straight into the iceberg, all smiles and confidence. It wasn't just my gut feeling that was picking up on things. Mrs. Parker, our other neighbor, is one of those old women who seem to know everything about everyone. A gossip with a mouth like a machine gun. She's lived on our street for over 40 years, and if there's even a whiff of scandal, you can bet she's right in the thick of it, dissecting every rumor as if it's the gospel truth. I used to think she was just nosy, harmless. The type of lady who spent her days peeking out from her curtains to see who was trimming their hedges incorrectly. One afternoon, while I was busy mowing the lawn, Mrs. Parker waddled over, her faded floral dress billowing in the breeze, and a hat perched on her head that seemed fit for some royal gathering. "Jack, dear," she said, her voice oozing that sickly sweet concern that only nosy neighbors can muster. "I happened to see Mark at your house again yesterday. It seems he spends more time there than he does in his own home, doesn't he?" At the time, I shrugged it off, forcing a smile and nodding. "Yeah, we're close, you know. Just mates. He doesn't have any family around here, so—" She pursed her lips, clearly deliberating how much to say next. "Well, just make sure he's not getting too cozy with your Clara. It's not appropriate for a married woman to spend so much time with another man. People talk, you know." I brushed her off with a wave. "Yes, sure, Mrs. Parker. Appreciate the heads up." I returned to mowing, pretending not to hear her muttering as she ambled back to her house. People talk. What a load of nonsense. Mark and Clara were just friends. Nothing more. Hell, he was practically like a brother to me. And Mrs. Parker was just a bored old lady with too much time on her hands. Or so I thought. But after that conversation, I began to notice things that set off alarm bells in my mind. How Mark would linger just a bit too long during his visits. How he'd crack jokes about marriage, ones that felt too personal, especially the ones about poor Jack having to put up with the ball and chain. And Clara, she'd laugh, too hard, too long. I'd chuckle along, convincing myself it was all in good fun. Friends poking fun at each other, right? Then there was that particular night. Clara and I had been embroiled in a stupid argument. Something trivial about bills or groceries. Honestly, I can't recall the specifics. She stormed off to the kitchen, and I sank onto the couch, simmering in my anger. I must have dozed off because when I woke up, it was late, and the house was dark, illuminated only by the glow of the kitchen light. As I got up to switch it off, I froze in my tracks at the door. There was Clara and Mark, seated at the table, their heads bent close together, whispering conspiratorially. Her hand rested on his arm, and he was looking at her in a way I had never seen before. I cleared my throat loudly to announce my presence, and they both jerked back like kids caught with their hands in the cookie jar. "Oh, hey babe," Clara said, far too casually, as if she hadn't done anything wrong. "Mark just stopped by to borrow a wrench." "At this hour?" I asked, my voice barely containing my disbelief. "Yeah, well, you know how it goes," Mark chimed in, flashing me that friendly grin that now felt like a deceptive mask. "Sorry, mate, didn't mean to wake you." I nodded and told him to let himself out when he was finished. But that night, as I lay in bed next to Clara, my mind spun wildly. I replayed every moment, every word, every glance exchanged. For the first time, those cracks in my life weren't merely cracks. They had transformed into gaping chasms, and I was too terrified to peer over the edge. Denial can be a powerful force. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that Mrs. Parker was merely trying to stir up drama. But deep inside I knew. I just didn't want to confront it. Because once you allow that thought in, once you entertain the possibility that your best friend might be sleeping with your wife, there's no going back. And the worst part? The signs had been right there all along, and yet I had chosen to ignore them. Or perhaps I simply didn't want to acknowledge the truth. If there's one lesson I gleaned from this entire mess, it's that rage has a sneaky way of creeping up on you. It hovers like a dark cloud, following you relentlessly. Once you allow it to take hold, once you let that anger spill over, there's no putting the lid back on it. And that's precisely what happened with Mark. The weeks following my confrontation with Clara were suffocating. We barely exchanged words, and when we did, it was nothing but snide comments and bitter retorts, the kind of dialogue that clings to your skin like tar, refusing to wash off. I spent most nights sleeping on the couch, both of us avoiding eye contact, skirting around the harsh truth of our crumbling marriage. But it wasn't just her I was evading, it was Mark as well. He had stopped coming around, which suited me just fine. I didn't want to see his face, didn't want to confront the sick betrayal lurking beneath the surface of his so-called friendship. But then one day it all came to a head. I returned home from work to find Mark leaning against my front gate, casually lighting a cigarette as if he owned the place. The nerve of him to stand on my property as if everything were normal. A wave of fury crashed over me. My vision turned crimson, and my pulse thundered in my ears as I marched right up to him, fists clenched tightly at my sides. "Jackie boy," he called out, grinning broadly as if we were long-lost brothers. "Long time, no see. Thought I'd swing by for a chat." In that moment, all I wanted was to smash his face in. I could smell his arrogance wafting off him, like he believed he had escaped unscathed, as if I were still blissfully unaware. But I forced myself to maintain composure, at least until I could get some answers. "Chat about what?" I spat, trying to keep my voice steady. "You haven't shown your face around here in ages, Mark. I figured maybe you'd finally learn to stay in your own lane." He exhaled a slow, deliberate plume of smoke, making a performance of it, as if he were taunting me. "Come on, mate. Don't be like that. We're all good, right? Just a little hiccup in the road. No hard feelings." "No hard feelings?" He said it so casually, dismissing the fact that he'd been sneaking around with my wife as if it were just a minor inconvenience. My nails dug into my palms, and I could feel the blood rush to my face. "What the hell are you talking about, Mark?" He flashed that infuriating smile, the kind that used to feel warm but now felt like salt on an open wound. "Look, mate, whatever's happening between you and Clara is your business. I'm just saying, maybe it's time to move past this. Life's too short for grudges." That's when the reality hit me. He wasn't even trying to deny it. He was simply brushing it off, acting like I was overreacting to a silly spat. Something inside me snapped. Before I realized it, I was in his face, pushing him back into the gate with a force that surprised even me. "What? You think this is a fucking joke?" I hissed, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. "You think you can stroll in here and pretend we're pals after what you've done? You've been sleeping with my wife, you scumbag." Mark's eyes widened, either in shock or the sudden realization that he wasn't going to talk his way out of this. He attempted to push back, but I was already on him. My fist connected with his jaw, the sickening crack resonating in my ears like a gunshot. I lost all sense of time. It became a blur of fists and curses, a raw, primal rage consuming every fiber of my being. We hit the ground, tumbling through the dirt and gravel as I rained punches down on him. His face, his chest, anything within reach. He tried to fight back at first, but my pent-up anger fueled a strength I didn't know I had. I could feel the skin on my knuckles tearing, but I didn't care. All that mattered was the visceral release of my fury. Mark's blood, my own, and the rage that had finally burst free. Somewhere amidst the chaos, Mark began to plead. "Jack, please, just stop, man, please," he gasped between blows, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." But his apologies only stoked the flames of my anger. Each punch I threw was fueled by all those sleepless nights, replaying every laugh, every shared moment between him and Clara. "You don't get to say you're sorry," I roared, my voice raw with emotion. "You destroyed my life, you bastard." Eventually, I felt hands gripping my arms, pulling me away. I don't even know who it was. Maybe a neighbor or even Clara herself. They pried me off him, and I staggered back, gasping for air, my hands trembling with adrenaline. Mark lay crumpled on the ground, blood streaming from his nose and mouth, his face swollen and battered. He looked far from the arrogant man I had come to despise. He looked utterly pathetic. I didn't say a word. I turned and stormed back into the house, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the walls. That's when I found Clara standing there in the living room, as pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with fear and shock. "What the hell did you do?" she whispered, her voice quaking. I couldn't even bring myself to look at her. I did what I should have done a long time ago. We stood there in a thick silence, the air heavy with tension. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Tell me the truth, Clara," I demanded, my voice wavering. "How long has this been going on? How long have you and Mark been?" I couldn't finish the question. The words felt like venom. She turned her gaze away, crossing her arms defensively, as if shielding herself from me. "Does it really matter?" she replied, her tone icy and devoid of any warmth. "It's not like we've been a real couple for ages. You know that. Don't act like this is all my fault." Her words struck me like a physical blow. "Not all your fault? You cheated on me, Clara. You deceived me. Right to my face. And with him, of all people, my best mate." She didn't flinch or offer an apology. Instead, she stared back at me with those once loving, icy blue eyes that now only ignited my fury. "Yeah, I did," she replied, her voice calm. "And you want to know why? Because our marriage has been dead for a long time, Jack. We just never had the guts to admit it. I felt as though the ground had been yanked out from beneath me. I wanted to scream, to hurl objects, to make her grasp just how deeply she had wounded me. But I stood there, trembling, the room spinning around me. "So that's it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "You just gave up? Chose to have an affair because you were bored?" She shook her head, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a hint of regret in her eyes. "It wasn't about being bored, Jack. I was lonely. I was tired of feeling invisible to you, like I was just background noise in your life. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was mistaken, that I loved her more than anything. But part of me recognized she had a point. Perhaps I had taken her for granted. Maybe I had allowed the spark between us to extinguish without realizing it. But that didn't justify her actions. It didn't make her betrayal right. I didn't deserve this," I finally said, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "I didn't deserve to be lied to be betrayed by you. And by Mark." She didn't say a word. Instead, she stood there, her gaze fixed on the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. In that moment, I understood that there was nothing left to say. The marriage we'd built, the life we'd shared, it was all gone. All that remained was the wreckage. Now I had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. Alone. If you've never experienced a divorce, consider yourself fortunate. It's a battlefield. Only there are no rules and certainly no winners. After everything blew up between Clara and me, reality crashed down like a sledgehammer. Gone were the explosive fights in the living room, the shattered plates, the wild accusations. What remained was a mountain of paperwork, lawyers, and the slow, grueling process of dismantling a life piece by piece. Clara wasted no time in getting her legal team on board. I still remember waking up one morning to the sound of a stack of papers thudding onto the kitchen counter. Divorce documents, filled with legal jargon that felt foreign to me and demands that landed like daggers in my gut. She wanted everything. The house, the savings, even the damn car. I thought I was ready for it. Thought I could handle whatever she threw my way. But seeing my entire life reduced to assets and liabilities on paper, that was a whole different level of heartache. We started with mediation. The plan was for us to hash things out like adults, sitting in a room with our lawyers and splitting our lives in half. But it quickly became apparent that this was a fantasy. Clara wasn't there to negotiate reasonably. She was there to win. I could see it in her posture as she sat across from me, back straight, hands neatly folded on the table. She was cold, calculating, like I was merely an obstacle to overcome. And maybe I was. I knew she hated me. I could handle that. But the sheer greed and pettiness of it all, that was a punch to the gut I didn't see coming. Clara's lawyer, a slick guy in a fancy suit who probably earned more in an hour than I did in a week, threw every trick in the book at me. She claimed I had been emotionally abusive, that I'd neglected my marital duties, whatever that meant. It was all nonsense, of course, but in a divorce, truth takes a back seat. It's all about who can make the other look worse. And she excelled at it. Damn good at it. Before I knew it, I was fighting just to retain whatever shred of dignity I had left. The court hearings were a nightmare. There I sat in my least expensive suit, trying to keep my fury in check while Clara's lawyer painted me as some monster who'd ruined her life. And the worst part? Clara just sat there, nodding along like she was the victim in some tragic love story gone awry. She knew exactly what she was doing, twisting the knife, ensuring I'd be left with nothing. I considered fighting back, dragging her name through the mud, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. That's precisely what she wanted, to drag me down to her level. I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. It dragged on for months, court dates, mediation sessions, a mountain of paperwork that seemed never-ending. The whole process felt like a slow, suffocating descent into darkness. Every time I thought I'd found a lifeline, something to hold on to, she'd pull it away. Clara fought tooth and nail for the house, our joint savings, even the goddamn dog. I didn't even care about the material things. Not really, but each demand felt like another stab, a constant reminder of everything we'd lost. Then there were my parents. God, the look on their faces when I finally broke the news to them, when I told them why it was happening. My mom, bless her, said little. She just cried a lot, enveloping me in her arms as if I were still a child with a scraped knee. My dad, on the other hand, was furious. Not at me, but at Clara. I remember him pacing their living room, cursing under his breath, muttering about how that woman would pay for what she did to his son. But I didn't want that. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to move on, to pretend this nightmare had never happened. Some friends took my side, but others? They stayed neutral, saying they didn't want to take sides, as if this were some kind of sports match. That hurt more than I anticipated. I always thought loyalty meant something, but when things turned ugly, people looked out for themselves. And fair enough, I get it. But it doesn't make it any easier when you realize how alone you truly are. There was one person who didn't let me wallow in self-pity, though. Harry, my old friend from university. He showed up one day out of the blue, dragged me out of the house, and practically forced me to do something, anything, to clear my mind. That's how I ended up getting into running. Well, getting into might be too generous. It started with Harry thrusting a pair of trainers into my hands and telling me to meet him at the park at 6 a.m. the next morning. I despised it at first, the cold mornings, the biting air, the burning in my lungs after just 5 minutes. But it was better than sitting around wallowing in despair. Running led me to other activities. After a few weeks, Harry convinced me to try rock climbing. I remember standing before the wall for the first time, convinced there was no way in hell I'd make it halfway up without crashing down. But something about the challenge, the focus it required, it felt invigorating. For those fleeting moments, while I concentrated on my next grip or balanced myself, I didn't think about Clara. I didn't think about Mark. I didn't think about the divorce or the chaos my life had become. I just climbed, and that was enough. Slowly, painfully, things began to shift. The anger didn't vanish entirely, but it faded like the tide receding from the shore. I found myself looking forward to those early morning runs, the hours spent at the climbing gym. It felt like I was reclaiming some control, like I was rebuilding a part of myself that had been shattered. The legal battles dragged on, but eventually, we reached a settlement. Clara got the house. She could have it. I didn't want to be surrounded by memories of us anyway. We split the savings down the middle, and I kept my car. Fair enough. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. And once the papers were signed, once the ink dried on that final decree, I felt as if I could breathe again, like I could finally begin to move forward. For the first time in years, I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't have to justify my choices or make excuses. I was just me, and while that was terrifying, it was also liberating. I began to try new things, join a local hiking group, ventured into yoga classes. Yeah, me and yoga. Who'd have thought? And even tried my hand at cooking. It was messy, and half the time the food tasted like cardboard, but it felt good to create something, even if it was just a half-burnt lasagna. People say time heals all wounds, and I used to think that was nonsense. But it's not about healing. It's about filling that space with something new, until the wound doesn't feel so open, so raw. The divorce took its toll on me, that's for sure. But it also forced me to rediscover myself, to understand who I was outside of Jack and Clara. And for that, I'm strangely grateful. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to say that, but here we are. Life is a funny way of working out.